Please welcome with me Henry de Valence from Penumbra.
Well, hello everyone. It's great to see everyone here. I'm going to be talking to you today about the project that we're working on. It's called Penumbra, and what we're building is a cross-chain shielded DEX. So to start off, and just provide a little bit of context and motivation for what we see as one of the big problems, there's this question of like, okay, what are all of us building? Everyone who's here at this conference. In some way, the thing that we're all working on is some kind of coordination technology, right? We want to build these distributed, permissionless systems that allow people to interact with each other, to coordinate with each other in new and interesting ways, and to be able to do so, somehow more freely. And it's been pretty clear so far that there's actually a big demand for that, and things are working out pretty well so far. But there's this big problem. And the big problem is that real-world coordination actually requires people having control over their information. So one of the, I think, most kind of crystallizing examples of this is the incident that happened last year with Constitution DAO, right? So you had this, there was one of the original copies of the US Constitution went up for auction, and some people said like, hey, we've got these cool coordination technologies. What if we, all like distributedly gather together and try and like pool our resources and kind of collectively get a hold of this historical artifact instead of just having it go off and like be sold to some rich billionaire. And then what happened was that the CEO of Citadel just kind of like swooped in and then rugged everybody and just bid like slightly higher than the Constitution DAO was able to raise, and like all the bid amount was like on Ethereum, so you can just like look and see exactly how much you need to pay to win. So that I think is a kind of like crystallizing example. But if you think of really any kind of like serious real-world coordination that matters, you have to be able to have some kind of control over information in order to be able to do that. And so to do that, we need to have private coordination. And unfortunately, right, so far that hasn't happened yet. If we look at the systems that try to do private coordination using cryptography, all of them have really not received that nearly as much use as transparent ones. And so for us, we kind of got onto this question of like, okay, how do we provide some kind of useful functionality on a private ledger? Can we try to have like one kind of minimal use case where we could build something that would be genuinely better because it's private, rather than just being like, oh, here's this thing, and it's private, and you should feel good about that, right? And so the thing that's really interesting about trading as a use case is that it's a context where there's a very clear financial value immediately to having privacy, right? There's an obvious and clear benefit to not having your trading strategy be leaked. The idea that everybody's like record of everybody's trades is all public is a really great way for other people to learn about what you're doing and then figure out how to extract more value from you. So that's kind of the context. So what are we actually building? First of all, Penumbra is a private proof-of-stake L1. So we're building on top of Tendermint, but rather than using the SDK, which is designed around a kind of transparent model, we're building a fully shielded proof-of-stake chain. That chain provides a cross-chain shielded pool, so you can send any IBC asset into this chain, record it privately, do your private transactions. And the thing that's really cool is that we also provide a private DEX that allows people to trade without revealing their personal information. The way that this looks on a picture diagram is that you have this whole beautiful interchain, and as you do an IBC transfer into Penumbra, you shield your tokens, whatever type of token they might be. And inside of this shielded zone, you can transact, you can stake, swap, market make, and all of the actions that you take are protected. And of course, you can disclose your information to somebody if you want, but by default, you have security and privacy, and you're not just like broadcasting a history of every action that you've ever taken to everyone in the world who might not be friendly to you, right? So that's kind of the vision. And a really interesting question that kind of comes up in this model is like, how do we have private interaction with public shared state? If you look at a lot of the existing privacy systems, there's a way to do private interaction, just with your own state, right? If I'm sending tokens from one address to another, I'm not really interacting with anything that's public. But if you look around at all the DeFi applications that people actually care to use, basically all of them involve having some kind of public state, like, oh, there's these AMMs, there's whatever, and people want to be able to interact with the data that lives on chain. But there's a pretty hard problem here, which is that in general we could think of there's these different pools of value that are on the chain, and there's all these transactions that are happening, going back and forth between them, and we have this general problem of how do we hide information about individual transactions while still revealing information about the kind of aggregate state of various types of value that are on this system. So that's a kind of a very general and abstract way to phrase it, but looking at some concrete examples, right? Like, how do you hide the amounts of individual trades so that some individual trader doesn't reveal all of their information, but also still reveal what's the kind of state of the market, what's the aggregate view of everybody's, or what's the aggregate of everybody's views of what the prices should be. Another example for staking, right, is how do you hide delegation amounts while still revealing voting power? You want to have a proof of stake system that has accountability for validators. You need to know who's actually responsible for securing the network. But also, it shouldn't be that like every single person's delegation is just like totally public and revealed to the entire world. How do you hide individual votes, right, while still revealing governance decisions? We're already seeing on Cosmos SDK chains attempts to basically do bribery for governance votes by promising that, oh, well, we'll go through all the list of addresses that voted in the way that I like, and I'll airdrop you tokens, right? That's obviously not good in the long term. And the solution that we're working on for this kind of general problem, we're calling flow encryption. So effectively, this is, we're going to have many different users who have some values that they're trying to contribute to some flow between two different parts of the system. And what they're going to do is they're going to encrypt the amounts from their individual contributions to that flow. The chain is going to be able to aggregate all of those encryptions over some interval, right? And depending on what you're doing, that could be, aggregating all the trades in a block. It could be aggregating all the votes over a voting period, right? It's pretty flexible. And then the validators can decrypt only the batch total. And so effectively, right, this is like additively homomorphic encryption plus a long list of like extra properties that let you actually integrate it into a consensus system in a workable way. And the upshot of all this is that at the end, you can now do public on-chain computation on the aggregate of everyone's contributions without having to reveal sort of what each transaction's contribution to that flow was. So in a general kind of picture, you can use this to do private interaction with shared state kind of in the following way. So we'll start off with some user who has some private input. And when they prepare their shielded transaction, right, so by default, the transaction's not going to reveal anything through the use of other cryptography. they're going to produce two things. First of all, this encrypted input that they're going to send off as part of the transaction they submit to the chain. And they also get to mint this sort of like private state NFT that records whatever other data is necessary for the action that they're trying to take. The chain later, as that transaction gets included in a block, is going to be able to batch together all those inputs, decrypt a batch total, and then do some public computation, generate some public outputs of this, whatever the computation involving this shared state is, and then each user who had participated can combine those public outputs with their sort of private part of the state that they had and mint whatever the appropriate private output is. So again, this is like a pretty general picture of this state model, but I'll get in a second into how you can use this to do trading. The interesting thing to think about here, though, is that we actually end up with a quite different model for how our transactions are going to be affecting our chain state. So each contract each contract effectively is going to be executing once per block only. But when it does so, it's going to get a list of all of the transactions that were interacting with it. That means that you don't have any notion of ordering. There's no sequencing within a block. You're just considering the entire block of transactions as undergoing batch execution. And as long as the rest of the system has been built in a shielded way, the block proposer has no visibility on what any of these individual transactions are doing prior to them being included in the block. So you have this sort of perfect kind of commit and reveal system where not only are you protecting the transaction contents up until they've been finalized, but also as long as there's sufficient quantity of transactions in each block, you get long-term privacy for each individual user's contribution to whatever the shared batch computation was. And to show you an example of some really cool stuff that we can do with this, here's how we can use this to do some sealed input batch swaps. So our scenario, or our setting, right, is that we have various trading pairs, right? We'll say just there's 3 of them here. And given some block, you group all of the input trades by pair. You batch together the encrypted inputs, and then you have the chain decrypt all of the batch totals. And at this point, you could say, OK, well, now I have all these sort of batch trades, and I could apply them to the AMM. But we can actually do something that's like much cooler, which is you can consider all of the possible assets on your chain, build a graph of all of the trading pairs between them, and then globally resolve all of the trading intent in each individual block with optimal arbitrage to get the best execution for all the trades. That also means you can do some really neat things like doing like multiple hop routing. There's a whole world of optimizations you can do. And the great thing is that because you're only doing this once per block, you can make your AMM sort of much more computationally intensive without sacrificing the ability to continue executing the chain at a reasonable rate. Once you've done this, right, now you've computed these prices, the effective clearing prices for all these pairs, and you can commit those to the chain state, and everybody who had participated by sending in an input in that block is now able to privately mint whatever output funds they're entitled to without having to reveal sort of the amount of their individual participation in this trade. So hopefully that sounds pretty cool. If you'd like to know more, we have a whole bunch of links. We are building in public. We have a Discord. We have a big protocol spec. We are currently running some like variously broken test nets if you want to like hammer some stuff and see how it breaks. And yeah, so that's the end of the talk. If anybody has questions, happy to answer it.
Thank you, Henry. Yeah, and actually there are a bunch of questions. So a very obvious one is like there are a couple of questions that are very similar, so I will just make one question out of it. So where's the difference between you guys and Secret Network, and are you a competitor?
I wouldn't really phrase it that way. I would say that between Penumbra and Secret, there's sort of different points in the trade-off space between kind of near-term practicality, generality, and on the other hand, privacy and security. So with Secret Network, the model is that it's rooted in trusting Intel hardware, and that has advantages. Like you can just run code, and as long as you trust the Intel processors, you're good to go. But in the long term, I think that for building a genuinely decentralized private system, it's not really ideal to try to rely on, oh, well, we'll trust a specific hardware manufacturer and believe that basically entrust all of the long-term security of everybody's private data to, is it possible to break this particular type of hardware enclave? Because the answer is yes.
Got you. And another one is, you are heading towards privacy, and when people hear the term privacy in crypto, they immediately think about money laundering, etc., etc. So, how do you ensure that bad actors are not laundering money using Penumbra?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess the same way that with any other kind of business, there's not a way that you can have perfect control over what anybody does with a system. I think the thing that we focus on is what is the point of doing this? The reason that we're building the system like this is so that people can actually do concentrated liquidity on chain. If you don't have privacy, there's no way that you can have capital efficient market making on chain, because somebody who is doing their trading strategy, it just is going to be broadcasting their entire history to the world. So the approach that we have is we have privacy by default, and then we have the ability for people to disclose the track record of their activity to whatever parties they want to. So if somebody has their trades on Penumbra, they want to go to some regulator and say look, here's all the stuff I was doing. You can see that it's all legit. You can disclose your viewing key and be able to sort of demonstrate what activity you've done, but it's just by default not broadcast to the entire world. It's up to you.
Following up on the trading aspect, there's a question: can each user trade just one per block? Just one transaction per block?
I'm not quite sure I follow the question.
Can each user trade just once per block? If I want to make a trade in DeFi, can I just make it once per block?
Oh, I see.
I think that's the question.
It depends sort of, when you do a trade, effectively what's happening is that all of the participants in a trade are privately burning their input funds and then getting the permission to mint their output funds. So you can't trade the same funds twice in the same block, right? Because that's a double spend. But if you have two separate tokens that you want to be trading in the same block, you can submit those transactions in parallel. And then the other thing is, because we can do this kind of global resolution of the trading intents, a lot of the reasons why somebody might want to do sort of two kind of compound trades may not be as relevant. So for instance, if there's liquidity on this pair and there's liquidity on this pair, rather than forcing people to submit two separate trades to pick that up, if we're looking at this global graph of all of the liquidity on the chain, and resolving it in one go, you could actually just submit a trade for the leg that you want and have that be resolved using the liquidity that's available.
Cool. And another question is, how does Penumbra state model compare to general Cosmos SDK when considering full node computation requirements?
So another thing that's actually pretty interesting is that the computational requirements for the full nodes in a fully private system end up actually being significantly lighter than you might expect. And the reason for that is that when you're doing this fully private system, where are the state transitions happening? The state transitions are happening on the user's device because the user has their data. The data that is on chain is just like some hash commitments, right? And so all that the full nodes have to be doing effectively is just verifying a lot of ZK proofs, and verification of proofs is extremely fast, and you can do it in a big batch, et cetera, et cetera. And so as a side effect of building a private system, you also have some really cool scalability properties because most of the actual work of the computation is happening on each user's individual device because the user is kind of in control of their own data.
Speaking of the batches, there's another question. What are the trade-offs for market making on Penumbra's batch auction DEX versus normal concentrated liquidity AMMs? Are there trade-offs that lead to worse prices?
Unclear. So we're actually working on a paper on this, sort of framing like what exactly is the arbitrage problem on Penumbra. There's some ways in which it's more difficult. There's other ways in which it's much better. So for instance, like when you're trying to arbitrage the prices relative to an external reference market, there's a slightly more complicated game to play because you don't know, who else is going to be submitting trades at the same time as you. On the other hand, because we can do optimal arbitrage in consensus, we can ensure that every single market has prices that are consistent with each other, at least internally to the chain, and rebate those arbitrage proceeds to LPs or traders.
Another question regarding privacy. What about using private transactions when you need to reveal these data for tax reasons?
So that's something where the kind of viewing capability, that's actually a great example of a situation where having the ability to do selective disclosure with a viewing capability is really cool because you can have a fully private chain, right? And all of the transactions on it are private by default, but also you have this viewing key, and that doesn't give any control over your funds. It's just the ability to view. But you can take that viewing key, and you could imagine writing some kind of like tax software where you like plug in a viewing key, it scans through the whole chain, and then you like annotate whatever cost bases, and that can produce a whole report of here's exactly all the activity that's happened. I can verify, anybody can verify that against the chain state as long as they have the viewing key. And I can take that report. If somebody says like, oh, I don't believe you, then you can give them the viewing key. You can say, look, you can run this like exact program. But it's in the user's ability to do that. Rather than just sort of forcing everybody into this like transparent world where everybody can see everything at all times.
Yeah, this would be like very user-friendly, by the way. It would be like a dream come true for many people who are struggling with their tax declaration by the end of each year. Last question, is there any pre-sale planned?
No, it's just stay tuned. We'll have some info on the tokens later.
Sounds great. Thank you, Henry.